Welcome back, and we'll start where I said I would start when I finished the last lecture, and that is to look at the work of the new government, the government starting with President Washington in 1789, and look at their policies with regard to some of the domestic problems that confronted the country. Last time we looked at the foreign problems, so this lecture will be on the domestic problems, and those can be sort of summarized there with just one word: the economy. The economy was in terrible, terrible shape, and I talked when we were talking about the articles and what terrible problems we're facing during the time when the Articles of Confederation served as the governing document. But they sort of all revolved around the economy and the inability of Congress to deal with that under the Articles. So that means that the key person here will be the Secretary of Treasury. That's the government agency, the department that's going to be dealing with the whole financial structure of the government and the country. And that meant that the key person here was Alexander Hamilton, who had, as I told you, served as Washington's, the title was aide-de-camp but during the war, but that meant that he was sort of in charge of the Army's financial and business side. He was kind of the business administrator for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and serving under Washington. And so now Washington, who appreciated Hamilton's brilliance and ability during the war when he was on his staff, Washington put him in the position to come up with plans for dealing with the various economic problems that the country had been facing. I'm going to look at three different programs that Hamilton came. This is a little bit different approach than the book takes, but I'm going to talk about three main programs that Hamilton offered to Congress with his plans for trying to, turn the country into a successful economy instead of a struggling one as it had been under the Articles. The first will be dealing with the issue of taxation. The first thing we've got to do, and sort of everybody knew this, was the federal government's got to be able to get some money, something it could not do under the Articles. And that means we're going to have to find taxes. So, this is just an obvious starting point. Before the government can talk about doing anything else, it's got to get some money. It's got to have some way to get some money, or it's just going to be paralyzed, as it had been under the Articles. So to deal with that, Hamilton presented to Congress in 1789, one of the very first pieces of legislation dealt with by Congress, was the Tariff Act, which suggests then that the tax that he's going to rely on was a tariff. And I hope you know, a tariff is a tax on imports. The United States was a major trading nation. We imported a lot of the stuff that we used. So it's a pretty obvious thing to tax that source of revenue. And that's what Hamilton proposed. He had actually a wide range of taxes. He had many kinds of smaller taxes, some fees, a tax on whiskey, a couple of other things. But by far, the most important tax for the country was the tariff. And just to get a little historical thing, for more than a century, we relied on tariffs. And over the 100 years, tariffs went up and down, and we're going to be talking about it again because it becomes a contentious political issue. But tariffs accounted over, say, the first century of the country's history for approximately half the revenue that the federal government received. So it was a major source of taxation. Uh, and as I said, it became a political issue. It was not in Hamilton's time. The tariff of 1789, unlike some others that we'll hear about, were others were very, very contentious. The Tariff Act of 1789 was not. And this was a time when Washington had been elected unanimously. Americans had a very strong distaste for political partisanship, political parties. They identified that with Parliament. Parliament had been very political in its structure, and the intrigues and the plots and the game playing and the backdoor politics in parliaments was just a terrible, terrible problem. And Americans had experienced that. You know, when we'd been colonies, you know, Parliament was passing laws for us, but we were sort of like oftentimes in the middle of a political football going on in Parliament, that they were playing games, and there was this faction wanted to do this and this faction wanted to do that, and another faction wanted to do something. And a lot of times they were kind of using Americans as kind of a kicking ball, as a soccer ball that they kick around. And so it gave Americans a very bad feeling about politics. You know, that politics were, and especially partisan politics were sort of identified with Parliament. We don't want to be like that in America. We're sort of the anti-England. If England does it, we don't want it. And we just don't want to have this political divisiveness and feuds and bitter struggles. And so that's what's going on. Washington was elected unanimously. Hamilton's proposal for tariffs was very non-controversial. There's some debate in Congress, but it was very positive. People tinkered with it a little bit. But basically, Congress adopted the proposal that Hamilton made, and tariffs then, as I said, went on to become, for the next century, a major source of revenue. Approximately half the revenue, as I said, that the federal government received came from tariffs. Just a note, a little sidelight here, the other half came mostly from the sale of Western land. Remember, Congress set up the land ordinance of 1785, which provided for the sale of land in the West. And that first law didn't work well. It had to be tweaked, but it was tweaked, and over 100 years it provided approximately half the revenue that the federal government had. So you know, those were the two sources. That's where the federal government got its money. It got money by selling land in the West, and then by tariffs. And both of those were subject to controversies, and there were debates over it, and there were years when we got more and less because of the changes in it. And some of those were very controversial issues, as we'll see. And you know, big debates over land policy, big debates over tariffs. But just aside from all of those debates, and aside from the fact that some years the tariffs were very low, some years they were very high, whatever. As a generalization, the United States relied on tariffs and the sale of Western land. And that'll last until about the end of the 19th century, and then we'll run out of land to sell, or at least land that anybody would want to buy, and then the tariff will undergo a change too. So, but for us, those are the two sources of revenue, and it started with Hamilton and the Tariff Act of 1789, and that's going to provide us with revenue. All right, now we've got some money. Now we can deal with the second issue. And the second issue, which is a pretty big deal, and if you've been paying attention and you know what's going on during the period of the articles, you can sort of guess what this is, and that's going to be the public debt. During the war, Congress had borrowed tons of money, approximately half of it from Americans, half of it from foreigners, and then states had also borrowed lots of money, and as we've talked about that a little bit, that's very uneven. Some states had borrowed a lot of money, some states had borrowed little, and their responses to the debt had been very different. Each state had its own policies, and that's hard to generalize. But just to generalize, states also owed a lot of money. and those debts were dragging the country down. As I said, Congress had not paid any interest or principal on the debt during the whole period of the Articles, during the whole first few years after independence, and that created a great deal of hardship for people who held the bonds that were the records of the indebtedness. And so, that's been really dragging the country down, and it's got to be dealt with. And then the state debts is another thing. And as I say, some states had dealt with those states with their debts, and some had not. And I gave you the extreme example of Rhode Island, which had sort of come up with the non-solution of paper money. And it's just a whole big complicated story, and it's got to be taken care of. I mean, I'm just giving you a little bit of the information about the complexity of this issue, but bottom line is it's a serious problem, and it's got to be dealt with. So in 1790, Hamilton submitted to Congress a report. It's called a report on the public credit, but credit is sort of like the counterpart of debt. Credit is something that you have that's owed to you. Debt is what you owe. So it's sort of like the opposite sides of the same coin. And he's proposing what to do about the debts. Now, during all of those controversies and all of that dispute and feuds about the debts, a couple of questions had come up. One was, as I said, this issue that for Congress, for what we might call the national debt, half of it was owed to foreigners, half to Americans. And there were people in this country who argued that we should pay Americans first, and only after we retired our debt to the Americans should we worry about the debt to the foreigners. And so there's been some discussion of that, there's been a debate about that, and that's an issue out there. One of the things is, what are we going to do about the question of debts that we owe to foreigners? How are we going to deal with that one as opposed to the debts to Americans? And that's been a big question. The other one, as I was just talking about, is that states owe money. But having said that, that's a generalization which covers up a wide range of issues. There's all kinds of state debts, and states have done different things. So it's a very complex thing, and some states owe a lot of money and some don't. So the question is, to put it bluntly, should we tell states that they're responsible for their debt and then all of these differences will still be there? Or as an option, should we have Congress, the federal government, absorb the debts of the states? Should Congress take over the debts of the states and have the federal government pay it? Which of course would mean that some states are going to get a big benefit because some states have huge debts, and some states will get very little benefit because their debts are very small. And then it's also complicated because some states have been paying their debts. I gave you the example of Massachusetts, which has been real conscientious about paying off its state debt, and then other states have done nothing, or they've resorted to fraudulent solutions. The extreme example of that, and it's the extreme case, was Rhode Island. So there's this whole question of what are we going to do about state debts. And the third question is the fact that, as I told you, there's been an open market in the bonds that are the documents for the debt. And the price of those bonds in the open market has fluctuated. It's gone up and it's gone down. It's sort of like, the stock market today, which goes up some days and goes down other days. Well, the bond market had gone up some days and down other days, but the general trend pretty clearly was down. The value of government bonds had been decreasing as investors, just became discouraged that the federal government, the Congress, was never going to be able to pay its debts back, so who would want to own any of those bonds? And I think I told you that although you might think that the bonds have become worthless, that's a little bit overstatement, but the value, just to kind of simplify things and kind of round it off to make it easy to talk about, the sort of the going price for bonds by 1790 was about half of their face value, half of the original value of those bonds. So that's gone down. And what this all means is that people had paid widely different amounts for those bonds. I mean, to make a simple example, you might have, some $1,000 bonds that are, that have the face value is $1,000, but the people who own that bond on any particular day may have paid widely different prices for it, depending on when they paid it, depending on when they bought it. If they bought it originally from Congress, I mean, if they were the original lenders, if they were the sort of the first owner of that, the person who actually loaned the money to Congress during the war, theoretically they had loaned the face value. That was the idea. Although, in fact, it's complicated because Congress had often, in order to sell bonds, had been selling them at a discount. They were out there peddling bonds, and so sometimes they would offer discounts where, in order to get a $1,000 bond, you only maybe had to pay like $950 or something. $50 off. Just like any kind of marketing scheme, the Congress, as a marketer, was often forced to sort of sell bonds at a discount in order to sell them. So the prices that people actually paid for it don't have much reflection to the face value, because it all depends on when you bought the bond, and what the market, if you're one of the buyers who bought it on the open market, what was the market that day? What was the price you actually paid for it? And some of those bonds were still owned by the original owners, the people who had originally loaned the money to Congress. And some had 3, 4, 5, I don't even know how many owners as they changed hands, and each time it may change hands at a different price. So it's real complicated, and it's a real mess about what the people actually paid. And so the question is, how do we deal with that? What do we do about the fact that these bonds may have a face value, but you could almost generally say that has nothing to do with what they actually paid for it. So because of all of the history of these bonds, since they were first issued by Congress, and even at the first issue, oftentimes the face value had nothing to do with the person actually paid. So it's a real mess, and there's been a good deal of discussion about how we straighten that out. All right. So Hamilton made his proposal for what to do about it. And first of all, on the issue of what to do about the foreign debt, his argument was, we've got to restore our credit rating. The fact that it's been nearly a decade since the war ended. Well, it's been 7, 8 years, whatever it is, 9 years since the war ended. And during all of that time, Congress has been defaulting on its debts. As you can imagine, if you know anything about how credit ratings work, the credit rating of the United States was horrible. If you today go out and buy a car and borrow some money and then you don't pay on it, you're going to have a horrible credit rating and you're probably going to lose your car. So, credit rating is important, and that's what Hamilton is concerned about. He's trying to say we've got to restore the credit of the United States. And you can't do that if you discriminate in who you're going to pay and when you're going to pay them. We've got to treat all bondholders the same. We've got to treat the foreigners. We've got to restore our credit in foreign markets. What if we needed to borrow money again for some reason? Would foreigners lend us money if we borrowed money from them during the Revolutionary War and then didn't pay it back? So no, we've got to pay our debts, and we've got to treat everybody fairly and equally. So he rejected the idea of discriminating against the foreigners. He argued for paying everybody the same. And then what he proposed was what is sometimes what he called funding and assumption. That was the name of the legislation that he recommended to Congress. And he proposed it, and then somebody introduced it on the floor of Congress. Funding and assumption. Let me talk about assumption first, since it's the second one. But it's easier to talk about. What he meant by that was that the federal government should assume, that is, take over, assume the debts of the states. And it should do so regardless of how much money the state owed, whether they'd paid their debts or not, whatever. Just take all of those debts and have the federal government transfer those debts to the federal government, and the federal government will pay them regardless of what the state is. And as I suggested, that's going to benefit some states, but not others. And as you might guess, this then became a controversial issue. We'd avoided controversy on the tariff. We did not avoid it on the idea of funding and assumption. And in particular, southern states objected to it because, as I mentioned to you, the debts of states are, some states have very high debt and some states have low debts or no debts. And as a generalization, and it's complicated, if you look into the details, you might have to kind of modify and make some amendments to this or clarification of it. But just to get to simplify the whole thing, since most of the fighting of the war had been in the north, northern state militias had done more of the fighting, and therefore northern state governments had borrowed more money to pay for their militias and for all of the combat that they were engaged in. Southern states had less involvement in the war, and therefore their state debts were lower. So southern states opposed assumption. And they figured it would do them little good, and all the benefits would go to northern states. And yet, it's their taxes that are going to have to pay for it. Everybody's taxes are going to pay for it. State leaders in Virginia estimated that for every dollar that they got in benefits from this, northern states would get $5. And yet they're all going to have to pay for it at the same rate. So what this amounts to is that Virginians are going to be paying taxes, they're going to be paying tariffs the same as everybody else, at the same rate as everybody else, but the money is going to go to northern states, not to Virginia. And so they were opposed to it. And this meant that two of the famous national leaders who are from Virginia are now opposed to Hamilton's plan for assumption. And those two men, if you should know, not a secret, are Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And remember, Madison and Hamilton had sort of been partners during the debate over ratification. They were two of the three authors of the Federalist Papers. And so they were partners on the whole debate over ratification. They had both been leaders of the Federalist pro-ratification movement. And Jefferson, on the other hand, had been, remember, non-involved. He was over in Paris during that whole time. But now they became the strong opponents of Hamilton's plan. Eventually, a deal was struck to solve this issue. And like a lot of these deals, we're only partly aware of what the deal was. We know some things that happened, and we kind of assume what happened, and we don't know for sure, but we know that there was a dinner at the home of James Madison, who incidentally at this time was a widower. His wife had died. And he invited Madison and Hamilton to his home for dinner one night, and we know that took place. We don't know what they discussed, but we're pretty sure that what they discussed was a deal that involved, of all things, the national capital. Other issues that the Congress is dealing with, which don't have anything to do with the economic situation, but are just other questions that had become very political, was where to locate the national capital. And everybody wanted it. Every state wanted to have the national capital in their state because they figured that it would be a source of activity and business and money making. So it's considered a real economic prize to get the capital in your state. And it had become very, very bitter. Every state was fighting for it. And we think that what happened at that famous dinner at the home of Thomas Jefferson was that Hamilton said he would support having it in Virginia. And so, as you may know, Washington, D.C. was located, actually, it's a little bit complicated because originally it was going to be half in Maryland and half in Virginia. But it was going to be right on the Potomac, the border between Virginia and Maryland. And so it would be beneficial to Virginia. So this is a deal for Virginia to get the national capital. And in return, Madison agreed to sort of drop his opposition to assumption and to accept it. And we don't know that actually happened. As I said, we know that there was a dinner, but we don't know what went on over the dinner table in the conversations among those three men. But we know what happened, and the Congress did vote to put the capital at the present site of Washington, D.C., which is right there at Virginia. And we know that Congress voted for assumption. So that did get done. Hamilton's plan for assumption got done as a result of that sort of political deal. Funding was much more controversial and much more difficult. By funding, Hamilton meant that the Treasury Department, which he had and is the financial arm of the federal government, the Treasury Department would issue bonds, new bonds, to replace the old bonds, and the idea is they will be fully funded. That's why it's called funding. What that means is that the new bonds would be issued with face value equal to the face value of the bonds they're replacing plus all the interest that's accrued. And remember, Congress has not been paying interest on those bonds ever. So every year what they would do is they would just take the interest for that year and just say, okay, we'll add it to the principal for next year. And so every year, even though they don't spend any money, Congress goes deeper and deeper into debt because every year they just turn around with the interest. So the interest in some cases is pretty high. I mean, after some of those bonds have been outstanding for many years, and every year they accumulate some interest, and every year they get more interest because there's more debt. So because of the previous debt, it's compound interest if you understand the math of that. And so, but it's going to be at full face value, regardless of what the person who actually held it had paid for it. And think about this, some people, some of those bondholders, and there's, a wide range of people who own those bonds, and the amounts that they paid run from nearly full value to half of the face value, but they're all going to get full value. And as a generalization, people who had bought their bonds recently, when the market had been going down, 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 and so at its lowest point, which is just the, yesterday was the lowest market, people who bought their bonds yesterday, or very recently, probably paid half of it, half of the face value, but they're going to get their full face value in new bonds. In other words, they're going to double their money. Whereas the people who included the original lenders, and there's some people out there who were the people who were original lenders and had paid nearly full face value, are only going to get full face value. They're going to get the same what they put in, whereas other people will have paid double, will make double. So Madison and Jefferson and other members of Congress are bitterly opposed to Hamilton's plan for funding. They argue that it's totally unfair, and they even charged that it was corrupt, because on the floor of Congress, Madison, former partner of Hamilton, now is charging that some people had bought bonds just before Hamilton's announcement because Hamilton had tipped them off. That there was actual corruption in this whole process. That there are friends of Hamilton, if you will, who have been tipped off to buy the bonds, and now they're going to double their money because they had inside information. And if those charges were true, and Hamilton denied them, but if they were true, that would be under present law. I don't know if it was illegal then, but that's like inside information on a trade. That's totally illegal. So it would have been a criminal activity that they were accusing Hamilton of doing. And privately, although they did not charge this on the floor of Congress, but privately, Madison and Jefferson, who were sort of combining to lead the opposition to Hamilton's plans, Madison and Jefferson believed that among the people who bought bonds sort of at the last minute and are going to double their money when the funding takes place, and they're going to get twice the value of what they paid, they're going to get the full face value even though they only paid half of it. They believed that among the people who were the insiders was Hamilton himself. That Hamilton was having friends use his money to buy some bonds, and that then he's going to double his money when funding is approved. They didn't charge that publicly, but they were convinced of it. The country has become divided politically between the friends of Hamilton, the pro people, the people who were pro funding, and the opponents, led by Jefferson and Madison. Jefferson sort of behind the scenes because he's a member of the administration. Remember, he's Secretary of State. He and Hamilton are colleagues. They're both members of Washington's cabinet. So it's a little strange that they're opponents, even though they both serve in the Washington administration as secretaries. And then Madison, the former colleague of Hamilton on the Federalist Papers, but they're totally divided, and there's a big political controversy. Eventually, the people supporting Hamilton would adopt the name Federalists. They used that word, they recycled that word. Many of them had been Federalists. Hamilton had been a Federalist, but not all. I mean, Madison had been a Federalist, but he's now on the other side. But they just used the word Federalist. And the people who were opposed to it, led by Madison and Jefferson, eventually started to call themselves Republicans. And they became political parties, something that we'd not wanted, but there it is. And I might just put as a note, Washington was just appalled by that. Washington was very discouraged that the country had been polarized into political factions during the debate over funding of the debt. And he took that pretty hard because he had really disliked political parties, and he did not like to engage in partisan politics, and always considered himself above politics because he had such a strong distaste for this idea of the parliamentary kind of political manipulation, which he identified with Parliament, and that's for them, not for us. But there it was, and the debate was there. As I told you, the opponents' main opposition was that this was corrupt, that there was inside information, and that some people are going to make a ton of money just because they happen to have been tipped off by Hamilton. Hamilton's argument was, yeah, some people are going to make a lot of money on this. I mean, you can't deny that. I mean, whether it was because of inside information that he provided or not, he would say, no, it wasn't this. They had just done it. But he said, look, people who bought the bonds bought them because they believed in the United States. They had confidence in our future. The thing that divided the people who were buying and selling was the sellers were selling their bonds because they had lost faith in the country. They had given up. They were dumping their bonds. They were selling them, even though in many cases they lost money on the sale. They sold it for less than they paid for it, but they wanted to get out of the bond. They wanted to sell it, get it off their hands, because they don't think Congress is ever going to be able to pay it back. I mean, that's what they're saying by the fact that they want to sell it. And the people who are willing to buy it are saying, I'm buying it, yeah, Congress has never paid any interest on this, but I'm buying it because I think Congress is going to be able to do it. I think Congress is going to make it. As of this is 1790, there were people in this country who were really worried whether the country was going to survive. We're just starting. We've just got the Congress, got the Constitution approved. We've had some really tough times. We've been through several years and did poorly. Things look really bad for the country. A lot of people thought the United States is not going to survive. In particular, there were a lot of people in England who were kind of exulting about, yeah, you guys go be independent, go be smart ass, go out and have your republic and talk about all that stuff. But we bet you that within a couple of years, you're going to come back on your knees begging to be readmitted to the British Empire, begging to be taken over because you can't make it. That republics can't survive. Republics are inherently unstable. It's not going to make it, and you're gonna be glad to get back into monarchy. You're gonna come begging to us. And there were people in Britain who were confident that the United States was going to fail, and there were people in America who were very, very discouraged. And what Hamilton is saying is that the people who are selling the bonds are the people who've given up on the United States, and the people who are buying them are people who still have confidence in us. And he said, yeah, we should reward the people who are pro-American. They should, if they've bought bonds because they think they're going to make it, they deserve a reward, and the reward would be that we're going to pay off give them a new bonds, the funding bonds at a face value, and they're going to double their money because they only paid half for the bond that they're going to be relinquishing. And he said, look, any government has to survive on the support of the wealthy, powerful people in that country. If the wealthy, powerful people become convinced that the country is going to fail, they're going to turn on it, and it'll end up being destroyed. We need to show those people, the powerful people, that they can support the country. Well, how do you get their support? Well, he said it's kind of a dicey thing, but what you do is you give them money. You show them that if the country survives, they're going to get money. And you don't want to just hand it to them. You find some way to make it attractive to them that's perfectly legal and perfectly ethical. And he said, look, let's face it. Human beings are inherently selfish, mean, nasty, greedy. What people do things because it makes them rich. This is a very sort of sarcastic view of human nature, but that was what Hamilton did. Hamilton, he's quoted as saying, "The people, sir, the people is a great beast. People are basically mean, nasty, selfish." And sometimes that quote is taken as a sign that he had contempt for common people. That when he says the people, a lot of times we assume that he means kind of middle class, lower class people. No, he meant human beings. He meant all people. Rich people are just as mean and selfish, and everybody, they're all mean and selfish. They're all just out for money. He said the trick is to turn that selfishness into a positive thing for the country. Make some benefit from it, which is hard to do. But he said, look, one way to do it is to borrow money from them. He's quoted as saying, "A public debt is a public blessing." Because if you owe money, people will support you as the only way they're ever going to get their money back. The people we're benefiting people. We're giving them all these bonds. But they'll have a very definite interest. It'll be to their self-interest, which is what motivates people, their self-interest, meaning their way to get money. They're motivated by their self-interest if the country survives. If something happens to the country and it ends up falling apart and rejoining the British Empire, all those people with all their bonds are going to be out. They're going to have nothing. So they have a very strong interest to ensure that the country survives. So let's take advantage of that. Let's use that to our benefit. It's sort of interesting that you're using private greed for public benefit. That the greed of people is going to work to the benefit of the country. And he said, let's just do it. So Congress did approve funding. And it turned out that Hamilton was exactly right. The bonds got changed at full face value. Some people made a lot of money. But over the years, within a couple of years, the bonds of the U.S. government, which had been, under the Articles, had been selling at half price, they went up and they were selling at a premium. They were selling like at about 110, 115% of their face value, as opposed to 50% during the bottom of the period of the Articles of Confederation, just before funding and assumption went into effect. So, and the key to it was that the government had tax revenue from the tariff to pay interest and principal on its bonds. Hamilton said, let's make those bonds long-term. They were 40-year bonds, which means that you're going to pay more money in interest than you will in principal over the pace of 40 years. Hamilton says, that's fine. That's good. Let's do it that way. Because that way, for 40 years, you're going to have a whole bunch of people out there. Yeah, they're going to be the rich and powerful people, but it's going to be to their interest to see that the government works. They're going to do everything possible to ensure the survival and the prosperity and the health of the country, which is his goal, to make it a healthy, prosperous economy. Okay, so that took care of the issue of the debt. And yeah, it worked out fine, but it left the country politically divided into Federalist and Republican parties. Now we come to the third of Hamilton's proposals, 1791. And this relates to the basic question of money. And as you know, money is gold, but everybody knows that that there are such things as banks, that you can set up banks, and banks can issue paper money, and that way we can get a lot more money than we have in gold. The way that the banking system works, banks are money multipliers. They take gold in, but they issue more in paper money, and it works on the assumption that people will have faith that they can redeem their money, so they won't want to, as long as they know they can. And so banks can have gold reserves and issue paper money, and it's backed up by the gold, and then the paper is just as good as gold. There's just a lot more of it, and that's a wonderful thing, and it works as long as people have confidence in the banking system. As long as people have confidence that the bank is sound, then they're perfectly willing to let their gold sit there and just to use the paper money instead. So everybody knows about this whole system of paper money and banks and so forth. England had invented it a century earlier, or even more than that. And so banks are now starting to appear up all over the country. States are now chartering banks and setting up banking companies, and the banking companies are out issuing paper money. But this is another real chaotic scene, sort of like state debts and so forth. State banking is just a chaotic scene. And some states do a very good job of regulating their, what we call state banks, the banks that they set up. Some states have very strict rules regulating the banks. They require good, solid reserves of gold, and in some states the system is working very well. And the states where it works very well is not a surprise. You can imagine Massachusetts, which is run by really serious urban bankers or urban business types. Their banking system is very sound. The banks there have good solid reserves. So the paper money that they issue is really quite solid. It's good money because it's solidly backed up by gold. And other states are just, the rules are just sort of woo-hoo-hoo. The state banks are issuing paper money that's just backed up by who knows what, and what the paper money is worth is anybody's guess, and it's a chaotic situation with hundreds of banks in the country, with hundreds of different bank notes being issued. Every bank is issuing paper money, and some of that is good, and some of it is just absolute toilet paper. So it's a real mess. And Hamilton says, we got to do something about this. He said, now this is why I said we should get rid of the states. This is why when I was at the convention, I was trying to get rid of the states so we'd have one national banking system. Because that's what we got to have. We've got to have banking system. I mean, this is crazy for the economy of the country. It's crazy for businessmen who naturally they want to sell their product, but they want to be sure that if they take some money in exchange for the product, that what they're going to get is worth something. And it's real hard for banks, for businessmen to keep track of all this paper money. There's hundreds of banks out there, and nobody can keep track of all of them. And nobody knows if the money is any good or not. Maybe this is a good bank, maybe not. Who knows? It's so crazy. So we've got to have something. So he proposed, as the third component of his plan in 1791, that Congress establish the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States. Now this will be a private corporation. The banks are private corporations. This will be a private corporation with a charter from Congress. State banks all have charters, like any other corporation, they have to have a charter. but they get their charter from the state legislature. The Bank of the United States will get its charter from Congress. And it will be a private corporation, but the U.S. Treasury Department will own 1/5 of the stock of the bank. So the bank will have as its largest stockholder the U.S. government, the Treasury Department. So the Treasury Department will basically control the Bank of the United States. So although it's going to be a private corporation, it's going to be controlled by the federal government. And it will be like any other bank. It will make loans. I mean, that's what banks do. They make loans. They make their money by charging interest on their loans. And they get the money by printing it. And so the Bank of the United States will have gold reserves, but it will also have as reserves something that's as good as gold, and that is U.S. government bonds. Since the days of funding, which is done, and the bonds are all real solid, that means that U.S. government bonds are fully guaranteed, fully secure, and they are to this day. The most solid investment in the world is U.S. government bonds. Always has been, ever since the days of Hamilton. And that means that the Bank of the United States can use its bonds, can use U.S. Treasury bonds as part of its reserve. Along with actual gold, it will also be able to use Treasury bonds. So this whole plan of Hamilton is a package, and it all depends on the fact that the tariff is producing enough revenue so that the bonds are very full, they're fully guaranteed, they're worth their weight in gold, they're worth their full face value, and then the banks are going to be able, the Bank of the United States is going to be able to make loans to promote the economic growth of the country by by printing paper money backed up by gold and treasury bonds. And it's going to be solid, so it's going to be a good banking business. But it's also, because it's owned by the Treasury, it's also going to serve another function. It's going to be able to regulate state banks. And that's complicated as to how that's going to happen. And I see I've run out of time here. So I'm going to have to stop. I'm going to have to get off my schedule a little bit in order to finish up this whole issue of the Bank of the United States, which we'll take up in our next lecture. Now, for today's question, what compromise or what political deal enabled Congress to work out a deal to pass Hamilton's plan for assumption, for a federal assumption of state debt? What was the basis of that sort of secret deal? And we'll talk about the bank in our next class.